My dad became dangerously obsessed with his therapist after mom died and broke into her house, wearing his wedding tux, so I systematically documented his insanity and orchestrated his downfall in the most psychologically devastating way possible. I was 14 when I walked in on my dad with a rope around his neck. Mom had died giving birth 5 days earlier. The night before she went into labor, I'd watched them slow dancing in our kitchen, talking about how lucky they were. The song they had playing in the background was the song Dad had playing now. I must have spent 10 hours convincing him to untie that rope, and that night we started looking for therapists. That's when we found Dr. Monroe. She looked eerily similar to Mom, and the moment Dad saw her, he leapt out of his chair and said, "That's the one." At first, I thought him going to therapy was a good thing. He started showering again and eating breakfast. He even smiled when Dr. Monroe suggested he started journaling his feelings. But then little things started happening. He began arriving at his appointments 45 minutes early just to sit in the parking lot and watch her through the office windows. He brought Mom's favorite tea bags to leave in the office break room and baked cookies from Mom's recipe to give to her. Recipe for the other grieving clients. One session he accidentally called Dr. Monroe by Mom's name. He turned red and apologized, but it happened 2 more times after that. The last time he reached across and touched her hand the same way he used to touch Mom's. "I saw Dr. Monroe at Whole Foods yesterday," he told me one evening while making dinner. "Her daughter has the same smile as you did at that age." Something cold settled in my stomach. How do you know what her daughter looks like? "Oh, she was with her." Small world, right? He kept chopping, but his eyes stayed focused on something far away. "She was buying the same yogurt Mom used to get, the strawberry kind with the blue lid." I started finding things. A notebook where he'd written Dr. Monroe's license plate number, receipts from the coffee shop she went to every morning, time-stamped 15 minutes before she usually arrived. He also started leaving the house at weird times. He joined a gym across town that happened to be next to Dr. Monroe's yoga studio. He switched grocery stores to the one near her office and started shopping at the time she did. The calls started coming a month later. Dr. Monroe's office manager phoned to say Dad had been demanding extra sessions and showing up on days he wasn't scheduled. He'd sit in the waiting room for hours, telling other patients about Mom and showing them photos. Then the therapy practice banned him entirely after he waited in the parking lot until Dr. Monroe came out and tried to give her Mom's old jewelry. After they banned him, Dad got worse. He hired a private investigator to find where she'd moved her practice, started calling different therapy offices pretending to be looking for referrals just to hear if she worked there. He created fake social media accounts to follow her and her family. He'd mapped out her jogging route and started running the same path every morning, always staying just far enough behind that she wouldn't notice. The breaking point came 4 months after everything started. Dr. Monroe's husband was traveling for work, and her kids were at a sleepover. He picked the lock and broke into their house at 2 a.m. wearing his wedding tux, the same charcoal gray suit he'd worn to marry Mom. He brought their wedding china and set the dining room table for 2. Their wedding video played on repeat on Dr. Monroe's TV while he taped their wedding photos over every family picture in the house. He laid Mom's wedding dress across her bed and lit candles that spelled out L+P forever on her dresser. The whole house reeked of Mom's perfume. Dr. Monroe came out of the shower in her robe to find him kneeling in her bedroom holding Mom's engagement ring. "I know you came back to me, Linda," he said. "You chose this body and this life as a therapist so you could heal me. Our love story isn't over." She was incredibly freaked, but tried to stay calm and explain she wasn't Linda. Unfortunately, Dad didn't like that. He tried to order her to accept the ring, but Dr. Monroe pulled out her phone. She tried to call 911, but Dad smashed her phone. He blocked the bedroom door and insisted they needed to consummate their reunion. He grabbed her hands and tried to force Mom's ring onto her finger while singing their wedding song. He kept talking about how her kids would be their family again. "Stop pretending you don't remember our first dance," he sobbed while forcing her to slow dance with him. "Stop pretending you don't remember our babies being born." The neighbor heard Dr. Monroe screaming and called the police. When they arrived, Dad told them to check her ID because this was his wife and they were having a marital dispute. He showed them the wedding photos, insisting they could see it was the same person, and they believed him. They actually believed. They left the house and let Dad continue. I need to create a continuation of the provided story beginning that picks up exactly where it left off. The story has established a disturbing situation where a grieving father has become dangerously obsessed with his therapist, Dr. Monroe, believing she is his deceased wife, Linda reincarnated. The police have just left after the father manipulated them into believing this was a marital dispute. I'll continue from exactly where the story ended, showing the immediate aftermath and the protagonists, the 14-year-old child, discovery of what happened, and their initial attempts to intervene. I found out about everything the next morning when Dr. Monroe's neighbor called our house. She explained what had happened, how the police had left, and how Dr. Monroe had eventually escaped by climbing out a bathroom window while Dad searched the house for their supposed wedding album. My hands shook as I hung up the phone. Dad was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming Mom's favorite song. He looked peaceful, almost happy, like nothing had happened. The contrast made my stomach turn. I watched him flip pancakes with the same hands that had tried to force a ring onto Dr. Monroe's finger just hours earlier. I confronted him immediately. He smiled at me with this dreamy expression and started explaining how Mom had finally revealed herself. He showed me a notebook where he'd been documenting what he called proof, how Dr. Monroe held her coffee cup the same way Mom did, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when thinking, how she used the same phrases Mom used to say. The similarities weren't coincidences to him. They were evidence of reincarnation. My first instinct was to call Dr. Monroe's office, but they informed me she'd taken an indefinite leave of absence. The receptionist's voice was cold when she recognized our last name. I tried her emergency contact number from Dad's old therapy paperwork, but it went straight to voicemail. I spent the rest of that day following Dad around the house, making sure he didn't leave. Every time he headed for the door, I'd find some excuse to keep him home. I needed help with homework. I wasn't feeling well. I wanted to watch a movie together. He seemed content to stay, spending hours writing in his journal about his reunion with Mom. That night, I searched his room while he slept. I found printed screenshots of Dr. Monroe's social media profiles, her work schedule that he'd somehow obtained, and receipts showing he'd been buying duplicates of everything Mom used to own, the same perfume, the same jewelry styles, even the same brand of shampoo. There were photos of Dr. Monroe taken from a distance at the grocery store, at her kid's soccer game, getting into her car, hundreds of them. The next morning, I tried calling our extended family for help. Aunt Sarah listened for about 5 minutes before cutting me off, saying Dad just needed time to grieve properly. Uncle Tom suggested I was overreacting, and that maybe the resemblance was helping Dad process his loss. Even Grandma, who'd always been protective of us, said it was probably just a phase, and I shouldn't interfere with his healing process. I skipped school to trail Dad when he left the house. He drove straight to Dr. Monroe's neighborhood and parked 3 houses down from hers. For 2 hours, he just sat there, watching. When her husband's car pulled into the driveway, Dad's whole body tensed. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. I thought he might do something right then, but instead he drove to the flower shop and bought 2 dozen roses, Mom's favorite. He left the roses on Dr. Monroe's doorstep with a note I couldn't read from my hiding spot behind a neighbor's hedge, but I saw her husband find them later. Saw him read the note and crumple it up up, saw him look around the street with fear in his eyes before ushering his kids inside and locking the door. Over the next few days, Dad's behavior escalated rapidly. He started calling in sick to work so he could spend entire days following Dr. Monroe's new routine. He figured out which park she took her kids to and started showing up there with old toys from my childhood, trying to give them to her children. He learned her husband's work schedule and would appear at places he knew she'd be alone. The pharmacy, the bank, the library. I tried everything I could think of to stop him. I hid his car keys, but he called a locksmith. I deleted the photos from his computer, but he had backups on USB drives. I even tried to stage my own intervention, sitting him down and showing him pictures of Mom next to pictures of Dr. Monroe, pointing out all the differences. He just smiled sadly and said I didn't understand how reincarnation worked, that the soul was the same even if the body was different. The school counselor was my next attempt at finding help. Mrs. Peterson listened patiently as I explained everything, but her response crushed me. She said it sounded like Dad was processing grief in his own way, and that unless he was threatening violence, there wasn't much anyone could do. She offered to call him in for a family session, but I knew that would only make things worse. Dr. Monroe tried to get a restraining order, but Dad was smart about it. He never directly threatened her, never sent messages that could be used as evidence. His notes were all about love and destiny and second chances. To outsiders who didn't know the full story, they might have seemed romantic rather than terrifying. The police said without proof of explicit threats or violence, their hands were tied. I started sleeping with my door locked, afraid of what Dad might do next. Some nights I'd hear him on the phone, leaving voicemails for Dr. Monroe at her old office, begging her to stop pretending she didn't remember their life together. He'd cry and promise to be a better husband this time, to appreciate every moment they had together. The breaking point for me came when I overheard him on the phone with a real estate agent. He was asking about houses for sale in Dr. Monroe's neighborhood, saying he wanted to be closer to his wife's new practice. He'd already started packing some of Mom's things, planning to recreate their old life in a new house just doors away from Dr. Monroe. That's when I knew I had to do something more drastic. The adults in my life had failed to see the danger, dismissed my concerns as teenage dramatics or misunderstandings, but I could see the fear in Dr. Monroe's eyes when I'd spotted her at the grocery store, constantly looking over her shoulder. I could see how her husband had started walking their kids to school instead of letting them take the bus. I could see how she'd changed her jogging route, her coffee shop, everything about her routine to avoid Dad, but he always found her anyway. I started documenting everything myself. Every time Dad left the house, I photographed his car's location, noted the time, and tracked where he went. I created a timeline showing his escalating behavior, hoping concrete evidence might convince someone to help, but keeping up with him meant missing more school, and the attendance office started calling. Dad intercepted one of those calls. He hung up calmly, then turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating. He explained that I was too young to understand the spiritual connection between souls, that my interference was preventing Mom from fully embracing her return. From that moment, he started locking his bedroom door, hiding his car keys in new places each night, and checking his rearview mirror constantly to see if I was following. The next morning, I woke to find my bedroom door handle had been removed from the outside. Dad had effectively locked me in while he left for what he called an important errand. I climbed out my window and ran to the neighbor's house to borrow their phone. I called every family member again, more desperate this time. Aunt Sarah finally agreed to come over, but only because she was worried about me missing school, not because she believed my concerns about Dad. When she arrived that afternoon, Dad had already returned. He served her tea and cookies, speaking rationally about his grief counseling and how much Dr. Monroe had helped him before the practice made an administrative decision to transfer him to another therapist. He showed Aunt Sarah the grief journal Dr. Monroe had recommended, filled with touching entries about Mom. What he didn't show her were the other 3 journals hidden in his closet, documenting every detail of Dr. Monroe's life. After Aunt Sarah left, satisfied that everything was fine, Dad confronted me. He wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. He spoke softly about how Mom's spirit had chosen to return in a form that would help heal our family, how Dr. Monroe's resistance was just confusion from inhabiting a new body with different memories. He genuinely believed that with enough patience and evidence, she would remember their life together. I discovered his next plan by accident when I saw a forwarded email on his phone while he showered. He'd been corresponding with someone claiming to be a spiritual medium who specialized in past life regression. This person had agreed to approach Dr. Monroe at her new workplace, pretending to be a patient, to help unlock her memories of being Linda. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. Desperate to warn Dr. Monroe, I tried finding her new office location myself. I called every therapy practice within a 50-mile radius, but none would confirm if she worked there. I even took 2 buses across town to check the medical buildings near where I'd seen her that day at the grocery store, but security guards turned me away when I couldn't explain why I was there. Meanwhile, Dad's behavior at home grew more erratic. He started cooking all of Mom's recipes, setting a place for her at dinner, and having one-sided conversations with empty chairs. He'd ask me to tell Mom about my day, gesturing to the vacant seat. When I refused, he'd sadly explain that I was hurting Mom's feelings by not acknowledging her presence. One evening, I came home from school to find Dad had redecorated the living room. Every photo of Mom had been replaced with pictures of Dr. Monroe that he'd somehow obtained. Family photos from her social media, professional headshots from old therapy practice websites, even what looked like yearbook photos from years ago. He'd used photo editing software to place Dr. Monroe in our family pictures, creating a disturbing alternate reality where she'd always been part of our lives. The breaking point came when I found a receipt for a storage unit rental. I biked there while Dad was at work and convinced the manager I'd lost my key. Inside the unit, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Dad had recreated Dr. Monroe's home office based on the glimpses he'd seen through her windows. Every detail was there. The same desk, the same chair, even copies of the same books on her shelves. But on the walls, he'd hung our family photos with Dr. Monroe edited in, and the desk was covered with forged documents. Adoption papers with Dr. Monroe listed as my mother, fake marriage certificates, even a birth certificate for me with her name on it. I took photos of everything with my phone, finally having the evidence I needed. But when I tried to leave, Dad was standing in the doorway. He'd installed a tracking app on my phone without my knowledge. He wasn't angry about my discovery. Instead, he seemed excited to share his plan. He explained how he was preparing a space where Mom could remember who she really was, where the 3 of us could be a family again once she accepted the truth. He drove me home in silence, but I could see him watching me in the rearview mirror. That night, he installed a new lock on my bedroom door, one that locked from the outside. He also took my phone, explaining that outside influences were confusing me, preventing me from seeing the miracle of Mom's return. The next morning, I pretended to be sick to stay home from school. As soon as Dad left for work, I used the house phone to call Uncle Tom, begging him to come over immediately. This time, I didn't hold back. I told him about the storage unit, the fake documents, the locks on my door. He arrived within an hour, and I showed him the photos I'd managed to email myself before Dad took my phone. Uncle Tom's face went pale as he scrolled through the images. He immediately called Aunt Sarah and Grandma, and within 2 hours, our living room was full of concerned family members. They searched Dad's room, finding the journals, the photos, the evidence of his obsession. Grandma broke down crying when she saw how he'd replaced every picture of Mom with Dr. Monroe. When Dad came home to find his family intervention waiting, his reaction wasn't what any of us expected. He smiled warmly and welcomed everyone, saying he was glad they'd come to celebrate Mom's return. He pulled out a cake he'd bought on the way home, a replica of their wedding cake, and started telling stories about how Dr. Monroe had unconsciously revealed memories of their life together during therapy sessions. The family tried reasoning with him for hours. Uncle Tom showed him the forged documents, explaining how illegal they were. Aunt Sarah pointed out the impossibility of reincarnation happening so quickly. Grandma simply begged him to get help, to see how his grief had twisted into something dangerous. But Dad had an answer for everything, a rationalization for every concern. He spoke about quantum physics, soul contracts, and destiny with the conviction of someone who'd spent months reinforcing their own delusions. As the sun set, the family meeting devolved into arguments. Dad accused them of trying to keep him from his soulmate, of being jealous of his second chance at happiness. He showed them what he called proof, videos he'd secretly recorded of Dr. Monroe at the park, zoomed in to show how she smiled just like Mom, how she laughed at the same things, how she pushed her hair back in an identical way. Uncle Tom finally lost his patience and grabbed Dad by the shoulders, shaking him while shouting about reality and consequences. Dad shoved him back, and suddenly everyone was yelling. In the chaos, I slipped out the back door and ran to the neighbor's house, begging to use their phone. I called the only person I could think of who might help, Mrs. Peterson, the school counselor. Despite her earlier dismissal, I pleaded with her to come witness what was happening. Something in my voice must have convinced her because she arrived just as 2 of my uncles were physically restraining Dad from leaving to find Dr. Monroe. Mrs. Peterson took control of the situation with surprising authority. She separated everyone, spoke to Dad privately, and then made several phone calls. Within an hour, she'd arranged for a crisis counselor to come evaluate Dad. She explained to the family that while Dad hadn't committed any crimes that would warrant arrest, his behavior suggested he needed immediate psychological intervention. The crisis counselor arrived with 2 assistants. They spoke with Dad for nearly an hour while the family waited anxiously in the kitchen. I could hear Dad's voice rising and falling, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. He showed them his journals, his evidence, explaining his theory about Mom's return with the same fervor he'd shown us. Eventually, the counselor emerged and explained that Dad was experiencing what appeared to be a severe grief-induced psychotic episode. While he wasn't an immediate danger to himself, his fixation on Dr. Monroe and the elaborate delusions he'd constructed suggested he needed intensive treatment. They recommended a voluntary commitment to a psychiatric facility that specialized in grief and trauma. Dad refused at first, insisting he needed to be available when Mom finally remembered who she was. But when the counselor explained that the alternative might involve legal consequences for stalking and harassment, he reluctantly agreed to a 2-week evaluation period. As they prepared to leave, Dad asked me to water Mom's plants and keep her side of the bed made up for when she came home. After Dad left with the crisis team, the house felt eerily quiet. The family stayed to help me clean up, taking down all the photos of Dr. Monroe and packing away the evidence of Dad's obsession. Grandma insisted I stay with her while Dad was getting treatment, and I gratefully accepted. Over the next few days, I learned more about what had been happening from Dr. Monroe's perspective. Mrs. Peterson, who knew her professionally, shared that Dr. Monroe had been terrified for months. She'd changed jobs twice, moved her children to a different school, and was considering leaving the state entirely. The police had been called numerous times, but without explicit threats or violence, they couldn't do much more than document the incidents. I wrote Dr. Monroe a letter, apologizing for everything Dad had put her through. I explained about Mom's death, about Dad's grief, about how the resemblance had triggered something broken inside him. I didn't expect a response, but I needed her to know that someone in our family understood the horror of what she'd experienced. A week into Dad's treatment, his doctor called to update us on his progress. The initial evaluation had revealed the depth of Dad's delusions. He'd created an elaborate internal narrative where Mom's death was just a temporary separation, where her soul had immediately transferred to Dr. Monroe's body, where their love story was continuing across lifetimes. Breaking through these beliefs would require intensive therapy and medication. The doctor also revealed something that chilled me. Dad had been planning what he called a reunion ceremony. He'd researched how to forge a marriage license, had been studying Dr. Monroe's husband's schedule to find when he'd be away for an extended period, and had even looked into homeschooling laws so he could keep Dr. Monroe's children once he brought Mom home. The storage unit was just the beginning of a much larger plan. During the second week of Dad's treatment, I visited him with Grandma. He looked different, calmer, but somehow deflated, like something essential had been drained from him. The medication had started to work, and with it came the crushing realization of what he'd done. He cried when he saw me, apologizing over and over, but also asking if I'd heard from Mom, still unable to fully let go of the delusion. The psychiatrist explained that Dad was experiencing complicated grief disorder, combined with what appeared to be a brief psychotic disorder triggered by Mom's sudden death. The resemblance between Dr. Monroe and Mom had created a focal point for his inability to accept the loss. It would take months, maybe years of treatment to fully address. As Dad's 2-week evaluation came to an end, the family had to make difficult decisions. He couldn't return home immediately. The risk of relapse was too high, especially with Dr. Monroe still living in the same city. Uncle Tom researched long-term treatment facilities, while Aunt Sarah looked into legal ways to ensure Dad couldn't access his previous stalking resources. I spent those weeks at Grandma's house trying to process everything that had happened. The grief I'd pushed aside while dealing with Dad's crisis came flooding back. I'd lost Mom to childbirth, and now, in a different way, I'd lost Dad too. Grandma held me while I cried, promising that we'd get through this together. One evening, while sorting through boxes of family photos Grandma had stored, I found pictures from before I was born. Dad and Mom in college, their wedding, their early years together. Dad looked so different then, full of life and genuine happiness. It was hard to reconcile that person with the man who'd terrorized an innocent woman in his desperate attempt to resurrect the past. Mrs. Peterson checked on me regularly, helping me process the trauma of the past months. She connected me with a grief counselor of my own, someone who specialized in helping teenagers deal with loss and family crisis. In those sessions, I finally had space to mourn, not just Mom's death, but the loss of the father I'd known before. Grief transformed him into someone unrecognizable. 3 weeks after Dad's initial commitment, we received unexpected news. Dr. Monroe's husband had reached out through a lawyer. They weren't pressing charges, understanding that Dad's actions stemmed from mental illness rather than malice. However, they requested a formal restraining order be put in place as a condition of Dad's eventual release. They also asked that our family cover the costs of the security measures they'd had to install, and the therapy Dr. Monroe needed to process the trauma. The family readily agreed to these conditions. Uncle Tom and Aunt Sarah worked with a lawyer to establish a trust that would pay for Dr. Monroe's expenses and ensure Dad couldn't access large sums of money without oversight when he was released. They also began the process of getting conservatorship, at least temporarily, to manage Dad's affairs while he was in treatment. As part of the legal proceedings, I had to give a deposition about everything I'd witnessed. Sitting in that lawyer's office, recounting months of escalating behavior, I felt the full weight of how badly the situation had spiraled. The lawyer was kind but thorough, making sure every incident was documented to protect Dr. Monroe and her family. During this time, I also had to make decisions about my own future. The house felt haunted by memories, both of Mom and of Dad's descent into delusion. Grandma suggested I stay with her permanently, at least until Dad was stable enough to resume some form of normal life. Uncle Tom offered to help me redecorate my room at Grandma's, to make it truly mine rather than just a guest space. 1 month after Dad entered treatment, his doctor arranged a family therapy session. Dad was more lucid than he'd been in months, the medication and intensive therapy finally breaking through the worst of his delusions. He still struggled with accepting Mom's death, but he no longer believed Dr. Monroe was her reincarnation. The session was painful, Dad breaking down as he truly comprehended what he'd put Dr. Monroe through, the fear he'd caused, the life he'd disrupted. He asked about her, whether she was okay, whether her children were all right. When the therapist gently reminded him that he couldn't have any information about Dr. Monroe or her family, Dad nodded sadly, understanding but clearly struggling with the guilt. He turned to me then, seeing clearly for the first time how his obsession had affected his own child. The apologies came in waves, for the locked doors, for the tracking, for making me responsible for managing his breakdown when I should have been grieving my own loss. I wanted to forgive him immediately, to have my dad back, but the therapist encouraged me to be honest about my feelings. I told him about the fear, the frustration, the anger at losing both parents in different ways. Dad listened, crying silently, accepting the pain his actions had caused. As the session ended, Dad made a request. He asked if I could bring some of Mom's real photos, not the edited ones with Dr. Monroe, but actual pictures of our life together. He wanted to start processing his grief properly, to mourn the person he'd actually lost rather than chasing an impossible fantasy. I promised to put together an album for him. That evening, I sat with Grandma and carefully selected photos that captured Mom's true essence. Pictures of her laughing at Dad's jokes, holding me as a baby, dancing in the kitchen on random Tuesday nights. Each image was a small grief and a precious memory. Grandma helped me write captions, sharing stories about Mom I'd never heard, helping me know her better even in death. The next few weeks established a new routine. I attended school from Grandma's house, visited Dad once a week at the treatment facility, and continued my own therapy. Slowly, I began to rebuild a sense of normalcy. Friends who distanced themselves during the chaos started reaching out again. Teachers who'd been concerned about my absences worked with me to catch up on missed assignments. Dad's progress was slow but steady. The delusions faded, replaced by a crushing depression as he fully grasped the reality of Mom's death and his own actions. His therapist warned us that this was actually a positive sign. He was finally beginning the genuine grieving process he'd avoided through his obsession with Dr. Monroe. It would be painful, but necessary. 2 months into treatment, Dad was stable enough to have longer visits. We spent an afternoon in the facility's garden, talking about Mom without the shadow of his delusions. He shared memories I'd never heard, like how they'd met in a bookstore when they both reached for the same novel, how she'd proposed to him instead of the other way around, how they'd dreamed of having a big family together. These conversations were bittersweet. Part of me was grateful to have my dad back, to hear these stories and see glimpses of who he'd been before, but another part remained wary, watching for signs that the obsession might return. The therapist assured us this was normal, trust would take time to rebuild, and vigilance was appropriate given the severity of what had occurred. During one visit, Dad asked about the practical matters he'd ignored during his breakdown. His job had held his position for the first month, but eventually had to let him go. The house payments were being managed by Uncle Tom, but decisions needed to be made about long-term arrangements. Dad seemed overwhelmed by these realities, but also determined to take responsibility once he was able. The treatment team began discussing transition planning. Dad couldn't return to our house immediately. Too many triggers, too close to Dr. Monroe's general area. Uncle Tom had found a small apartment near the facility where Dad could live while continuing outpatient treatment. It was a humbling come down from our family home, but Dad accepted it as necessary. As the 3-month mark approached, legal matters required attention. The restraining order was formalized, with clear boundaries about where Dad could go and explicit prohibition against any contact with Dr. Monroe or her family. Dad signed the papers without protest, acknowledging them as appropriate consequences for his actions. He also agreed to GPS monitoring for the first year after release, understanding that rebuilding trust required transparency. The financial settlements were harder for Dad to accept, not because he disagreed with compensating Dr. Monroe, but because seeing the itemized list of security cameras, therapy sessions, and relocation costs made the harm he'd caused tangible. The total was substantial but manageable with the family's help. Dad insisted on eventually repaying everyone who contributed, wanting to take full responsibility. One unexpected development came through Mrs. Peterson. She'd stayed in touch with professional contacts and learned that Dr. Monroe had successfully relocated to another state. Her practice was thriving in a new city. Her children were adjusting well to their new schools, and the family was beginning to heal from their ordeal. While we couldn't have direct contact, knowing she was safe and rebuilding brought some measure of relief. As Dad's release date approached, the family worked together to create a support structure. He would have daily check-ins with either Uncle Tom or Aunt Sarah, weekly therapy sessions, and regular psychiatric appointments to monitor his medication. I would continue living with Grandma, but could visit Dad at his apartment when I felt ready. Everyone understood that our relationship would be different now. I was no longer just his child, but someone who'd had to be his keeper, and that dynamic couldn't simply revert. The night before Dad's release, I couldn't sleep. Part of me was hopeful. Maybe we could build something new from the wreckage of our family. But another part was terrified that the moment he saw someone who looked like Mom, the cycle would begin again. Grandma found me in the kitchen at 3 a.m., making hot chocolate the way Mom used to. She didn't offer empty reassurances, just sat with me in the uncertainty. Dad's actual release was anticlimactic. Uncle Tom picked him up while I was at school, helping him settle into the apartment. When I visited that evening with Grandma, Dad seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he'd done and lost. The apartment was sparse but clean, with only a few family photos that I'd approved, all genuine, no alterations. We ate takeout Chinese food, attempting normal conversation about school and weather. Dad asked careful questions about my life, clearly trying to reconnect without overstepping. When I mentioned a school play I was considering auditioning for, his eyes lit up with genuine interest, the first real spark I'd seen in months. He promised to come if I got a part, then quickly added, "If you're comfortable with that." As we prepared to leave, Dad handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter he'd written during treatment, not an apology, but an acknowledgement. He wrote about understanding that he'd forced me to grow up too fast, to carry burdens that weren't mine to bear. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but promised to work every day to become someone worthy of being my father again. again. The drive back to Grandma's was quiet. I held the letter, thinking about all the ways our family had broken, and the uncertain path toward healing. Dr. Monroe had found safety in distance. Dad had found clarity through treatment, and I had found strength I never knew I possessed. None of us would ever be the same, but maybe that was okay. 3 days after Dad's release, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I asked to attend one of his therapy sessions. The therapist facilitated a conversation about boundaries and expectations. I told Dad I needed him to understand that I would never again be responsible for monitoring his behavior. That was his job now. He needed to prove he could maintain his stability not for me, but for himself. Dad accepted these terms gratefully. We established a visiting schedule that felt manageable. Dinner once a week, always with Grandma or another family member present at first. Phone calls were allowed but had to be scheduled, preventing the late-night spirals that had characterized his obsession. It felt formal and strange, but the structure provided safety for both of us. As weeks turned into a month, small signs of progress emerged. Dad got a part-time job at a bookstore, far from any of Dr. Monroe's previous locations. He joined a grief support group for widowers, finally processing Mom's death with people who understood that particular loss. He even started learning to cook properly, no longer recreating Mom's recipes obsessively, but developing his own. The real test came when Dad encountered a woman at the coffee shop who bore a slight resemblance to Mom. He called Uncle Tom immediately, recognizing the trigger and asking for support. They spent the afternoon together, Dad working through the emotions without spiraling into delusion. It was a small victory, but significant. He was learning to manage his grief without losing himself. I need to create the ending section that continues from where the middle section left off, maintaining 97% action until the final moments while resolving the plot direction about the protagonist overcoming their father's dangerous obsession with Dr. Monroe. 2 weeks after the coffee shop incident, I noticed Dad's behavior shifting in subtle ways. He started arriving late to our weekly dinners, his eyes unfocused and distant. The grief support group leader called Grandma to report Dad had missed 3 consecutive meetings. When I checked his apartment during one of his work shifts, I found new notebooks hidden under his mattress. Not about Mom this time, but filled with observations about the coffee shop woman. The entries started innocently enough, noting she ordered the same drink Mom used to love, but as I flipped through pages, the documentation grew more detailed. He'd learned her work schedule, discovered she taught yoga at a nearby studio, and had started timing his coffee breaks to coincide with hers. My hands trembled as I photographed the evidence and carefully returned everything to its hiding place. That evening, I followed Dad after he left work. Instead of heading to his apartment, he drove to the yoga studio and parked across the street. For an hour, he sat watching through the windows as the woman, Victoria, according to his notes, led a class. When she emerged, Dad's whole body tensed the same way it had with Dr. Monroe. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, but didn't approach her. Not yet. I called Uncle Tom immediately, but he was traveling for business. Aunt Sarah dismissed my concerns, insisting Dad was just lonely and maybe ready to start dating again. Even Grandma, who'd been so supportive, suggested I might be overreacting due to past trauma. The familiar frustration of not being believed crashed over me, but this time I knew better than to wait for adult intervention. Over the next few days, I documented Dad's escalating fixation. He switched his coffee shop membership to get a discount, ensuring he'd need to visit daily. He bought a yoga mat and workout clothes, though he'd never shown interest in exercise before. Most concerning, he'd started a new journal titled Signs and Synchronicities, where he documented every perceived connection between Victoria and Mom. The breaking point came when I discovered Dad had hired the same private investigator he'd used to find Dr. Monroe. The invoice, carelessly left in his car, showed he'd paid for a comprehensive background check on Victoria. I knew from experience how quickly this could escalate. Dr. Monroe had barely escaped, and I couldn't let another innocent woman suffer because of Dad's unprocessed grief. I spent the night creating a plan. First, I needed allies who would actually listen. Mrs. Peterson had proven helpful before, so I started there. I showed her the photographed journal entries and the private investigator invoice. Her face grew grave as she recognized the pattern. Together, we contacted Dad's psychiatrist, who agreed to an emergency consultation, but couldn't act without Dad's cooperation or evidence of immediate danger. Meanwhile, Dad's pursuit of Victoria intensified. He joined her yoga class, positioning himself directly behind her. He started shopping at the health food store where she worked part-time, always choosing her checkout line. He even changed his jogging route to match hers, though he carefully maintained distance to avoid seeming threatening. To outsiders, he probably looked like a shy admirer working up courage to ask someone out, but I knew better. I recognized the meticulous planning, the obsessive documentation, the way he'd already begun constructing a narrative where Victoria was meant to be in our lives. In his new journal, he wrote about how she moved like Mom, how her laugh carried the same melody, how the universe was giving him another chance at love. The delusion was building again, just with a different face attached. I tried confronting Dad directly, arriving at his apartment unannounced with Uncle Tom, who I'd finally convinced to return early from his trip. Dad's reaction chilled me. He smiled calmly and invited us in, serving tea while explaining that he understood our concern, but assured us this was different. He wasn't delusional. He knew Victoria wasn't Mom. He simply believed they were meant to meet, that Mom's spirit had guided him to someone who could help our family heal. The rationalization was more sophisticated this time, harder to dispute. Dad showed us his therapy attendance records, his medication compliance, his work evaluations showing good performance. He acknowledged his past mistakes with Dr. Monroe and insisted he'd learned from them. He was just lonely, he said, and was there really harm in hoping for companionship? Uncle Tom left somewhat reassured, but I saw through Dad's performance. That night, I made a difficult decision. I couldn't wait for Dad to escalate to breaking and entering or worse. I had to warn Victoria myself. The next morning, I waited outside the health food store until her shift ended. My hands shook as I approached her, and I probably looked like a nervous kid with a crush. But when I explained who I was and showed her photos of Dad's journal entries, her face went pale. Victoria revealed she'd already felt uncomfortable about Dad's attention. She'd noticed him everywhere she went, always hovering nearby but never quite approaching. Her boyfriend had pointed out the same man at multiple locations, and they'd started documenting the encounters. She thanked me for confirming her instincts and promised to take precautions. Within days, Victoria had rearranged her entire schedule. She switched yoga studios, changed her shifts at work, and started varying her jogging routes. But just like with Dr. Monroe, Dad adapted. He hired someone to follow her and report back on her new patterns. I only discovered this because I'd started checking his credit card statements online, using the password he'd never changed after Mom died. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Dad began leaving anonymous gifts at Victoria's new yoga studio, flowers with no note, expensive tea that happened to be Mom's favorite brand, a bracelet identical to one Mom used to wear. Victoria filed a police report, but without proof linking the gifts to Dad, they couldn't act. The familiar helplessness threatened to overwhelm me, but I pushed forward. I reached out to Dr. Monroe's husband through Mrs. Peterson's professional network. He couldn't share their current location, but offered advice based on their experience. He suggested documenting everything meticulously, varying routines unpredictably, and most importantly, never being alone. He also connected me with a lawyer who specialized in stalking cases, though she confirmed what I already knew, without explicit threats or violence. Legal legal options were limited. Dad's next escalation happened faster than expected. I arrived at his apartment for our weekly dinner to find him preparing an elaborate meal, all of Mom's recipes. He'd set 3 places at the table and cheerfully announced we were having a special guest. My blood ran cold as he explained that Victoria had finally agreed to join us, though he admitted she didn't know it yet. He planned to approach her that evening with an invitation he was certain she couldn't refuse. I excused myself to the bathroom and immediately texted Uncle Tom, Aunt Sarah, and Grandma from the phone I'd hidden in my jacket. This time I didn't ask. I demanded they come immediately, threatening to call 911 if they didn't. Something in my message must have conveyed the urgency because all 3 arrived within 20 minutes, along with Dad's psychiatrist who Mrs. Peterson had contacted. Dad's facade crumbled when he saw them. The calm rationalization gave way to angry accusations that we were sabotaging his happiness again. He insisted Victoria was different from Dr. Monroe, that this was real attraction, not delusion. But when the psychiatrist asked him to explain the 3-place settings and Mom's recipes, Dad's justifications became increasingly incoherent. He talked about honoring the past while building a future, about Mom wanting him to find love again, about signs and synchronicities that proved Victoria was destined to join our family. The psychiatrist recognized the returning psychosis and recommended immediate hospitalization. Dad refused, becoming agitated and accusatory. He grabbed his car keys, declaring he wouldn't let us ruin this chance at happiness. Uncle Tom and I blocked the door while Grandma called emergency services. Dad tried to push past us, and in the struggle his journal fell from his jacket, pages scattering across the floor. Everyone froze as they saw the contents. Not just observations about Victoria, but detailed plans. He'd researched her apartment building security, noted when her boyfriend traveled for work, and had even practiced picking locks again. One page contained a timeline for what he called the introduction, a plan to enter her apartment and prepare dinner, recreating his first date with Mom down to the music and candlelight. The evidence was finally undeniable. When the crisis team arrived, Dad didn't resist. The fight seemed to drain from him as he watched his family reading his plans with horror. As they prepared to transport him, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and asked me to explain to Victoria that he'd only wanted to love someone again. The delusion was breaking, but the pain underneath remained raw and unhealed. This time, the family didn't hesitate. Uncle Tom immediately filed for emergency conservatorship. Aunt Sarah worked with the lawyer to ensure Victoria received a protective order before Dad could be released. Grandma took time off work to stay with me, understanding that watching Dad relapse had reopened all my wounds from the first time. I met with Victoria once more, accompanied by Mrs. Peterson, to give her the full context of Dad's history with Dr. Monroe. She listened with a mix of sympathy and fear, grateful for the warning but shaken by how close she'd come to danger. She decided to move to a different neighborhood and thanked me for having the courage to intervene. Her boyfriend shook my hand, saying I'd potentially save them from a nightmare. Dad's second hospitalization lasted 3 months. The psychiatrist explained that the relapse, while devastating, wasn't uncommon in grief-induced psychosis. The medication needed adjustment, and Dad required more intensive therapy to address the core issue, his inability to accept Mom's death and his desperate need to fill that void. This time, the treatment team took a different approach, focusing less on the delusions and more on the underlying grief. I threw myself into school and my own therapy during those months. The school play I'd auditioned for became an escape, a place where I could be someone else for a few hours. Friends who'd stuck by me through everything became my support system. I even started a journal of my own, not to document others' lives but to process my own experiences. The family established stricter protocols for Dad's eventual release. He would live in a different city, far from both Dr. Monroe and Victoria. His internet access would be monitored, his finances controlled by the conservatorship, and he'd have to attend daily outpatient programs for at least a year. The GPS monitoring from before would continue, and any attempt to research or contact women who resembled Mom would result in immediate rehospitalization. As the release date approached, I made another difficult decision. I chose not to see Dad immediately upon his discharge. The therapy had helped me understand that I needed boundaries, that loving him didn't mean sacrificing my own well-being. I wrote him a letter explaining that I needed time to heal from the second betrayal of trust, but that I hoped we could rebuild our relationship eventually. Dad responded with understanding, though Grandma said he cried when he read my letter. He moved to the new city with Uncle Tom's help, starting intensive outpatient treatment immediately. The reports from his therapist were cautiously optimistic. Dad was finally engaging with the grief work he'd avoided for so long, though the process was painful and slow. 6 months passed before I felt ready to see him again. We met at a restaurant halfway between our cities, with Grandma present. Dad looked older, worn down by everything that had happened, but his eyes were clear. He didn't try to explain or justify anything. Instead, he asked about my life, listened to stories about school and friends, and shared his own progress in learning to live with Mom's absence rather than trying to replace it. The conversation was stilted at first, but gradually became more natural. When Dad mentioned joining a book club at his treatment center, his face showed genuine enthusiasm that had nothing to do with Mom or his obsessions. He was reading again, discovering authors Mom had never liked, forming opinions that were solely his own. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. As we prepared to leave, Dad handed me a photo album. Inside were pictures of Mom I'd never seen, ones he'd kept hidden during his delusions because they showed her as she really was. Imperfect, human, irreplaceable. He'd spent months in therapy learning to look at these photos without spiraling, to appreciate the reality of who she'd been, rather than the idealized version he'd projected onto others. We established a new routine, monthly meetings in neutral locations, always with family present. Phone calls were allowed but kept brief and focused on the present. Dad shared his progress in therapy, his struggles with loneliness, his efforts to build a life that honored Mom's memory without being consumed by it. I shared my own journey, the ways I'd grown stronger, but also the scars that remained. 1 year after the second hospitalization, Dad achieved a milestone. He encountered a woman at his book club who bore a passing resemblance to Mom. Instead of fixating, he excused himself, called his sponsor from the grief support group, and worked through the trigger in real time. He told me about it during our next visit, not seeking praise but acknowledging the work still ahead. The healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when Dad's grief overwhelmed him, and the family held their breath, watching for signs of relapse. But he'd learned to reach out for help before the thoughts could take root, to recognize the warning signs in himself. The medication helped, but more importantly, he'd finally accepted that Mom was gone, and no amount of searching would bring her back. I graduated high school with honors, my college essay touching on resilience without detailing the full trauma of those years. Dad sent a congratulations card, respecting my request that he not attend the ceremony. It hurt both of us, but we'd learned that love sometimes meant maintaining distance to protect everyone involved. As I packed for college, I included the photo album Dad had given me. The pictures of Mom no longer brought only pain, but also gratitude for the time we'd had. I'd learned to carry grief without letting it consume me, to stay vigilant without living in fear, to love Dad while accepting who he'd become. The family we'd been was gone forever, but from its ashes, we'd each found ways to continue living.